Deep into History is independent and exclusively listener-supported. Thus, before we begin, I'd like to thank all of my patrons and Spotify subscribers. Your support means the world to me in the show, as it is crucial to keep long-form independent podcasts like mine alive. Go to patreon.com/deepintohistory or directly on Spotify, as your financial support is desperately needed to keep the lights on, if you will, and you'll gain access to exclusive tales and early releases. And to everyone who has ever been kind enough to support my art, I salute you and thank you from the center of my being. This is Deep Into History, and I'm your host, Arjun Hundal.
Some history shows merely scratch the surface.
It's one small step for man.
We go a little deeper.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
This is Deep Into History. How deep do you want to go?
Our tale picks up exactly where we left off. It is late summer in the year 102 before the Common Era, in the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis, 19 miles northeast of the glorious port city of Marsilia, near a village called Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence. On a hilltop stand the legions of Consul Gaius Marius, who should be celebrating their glorious victory, having vanquished the hated Ambrones, but they could not. From the forested hills all around them, distant bonfires were lit and seemed to be the source of unnatural wails of grief and horror, not sounding human, but as if the legions were surrounded by undead escaped from Hades. Deep, primal screams and otherworldly chanting surrounded them and echoed in the valley. For in the hills beyond them, the Teutones had learned that their brother tribe, who had set out with them on their epic quest to find a new homeland more than 20 years ago, were all dead, and they were coming to kill the Romans. With no camp constructed, the exhausted legions had stood arrayed for battle and endured the pitch blackness of that nightmarish night. No attack came, but one thing was clear. The demonic hordes of the Teutones were coming to devour them all. As dawn broke, he set his cavalry as a screen while his men were put to work in a frantic effort to construct their fortified camp. It was complete by midday and finally allowed the exhausted legionaries to rest in shifts, while others manned and stood watch on the walls and towers. No attack came during that day or the subsequent night, and it was thought to have been due to the Teutones' difficulty bringing their wagon train back through the dense forest to face them. For as yet, the Romans had not seen a single Teutone warrior, which to Consul Marius meant that his rival commander, King Toitabad, was being cautious and wise. He was clearly keeping his tribe together and restraining his chieftain's desire for revenge by launching attacks in smaller warbands. The High King of the Teutones was clearly preparing for a full-scale, set-piece battle against his legions. The outcome he desired. However, his men were outnumbered at least 3-1. And though victorious against the Ambrones, the fear of the Teutones in combat, because of their unholy battle frenzy captured by the phrase Furor Teutonicus, that was spoken with dread by all the peoples of the Republic after they had annihilated a consular army at the Battle of Nerea in 113 before the Common Era. Even given the fact that his legionaries were familiar with the tribe after their ferocious assault on his fortress perhaps a week before, none of them had fought the tribe in direct melee combat. And after that awful night of the primeval wailing, he knew his men were unnerved. Marius decided that he needed an edge. A tactic that would give his legions a definitive advantage in the coming battle, something King Toitabad would never expect. His scouts were still out in force, and thus he knew that the enemy was still miles away, but their patrol radius was constantly shrinking, which meant that the Teutones were coming ever closer, and all indications were that at least the forward elements of the Teutone horde would breach the forest and be in sight of his camp the following morning. He had to act. Tired of staring at maps and the suggestions of his junior officers, he climbed the walls of his camp, to once again survey the valley before him. He studied the terrain, every inch of it, considering every detail. On the far side of the river, the vast plain rose to the heavily forested hills beyond. Yet the plain was not uniform. There were several large thickets of trees, spots of dense forest on the plain, clusters that could conceal not a legion, but a significant number of his troops. It could work. But this detachment would be at extreme risk of discovery. Even a barbarian child could wander in while playing. So he turned his eyes to his side of the river, to the much smaller plain at the base of the hill where his camp stood, and noticed that off to the sides, there were a few of these thickets, and one that looked ideal. So he decided, and made an epic roll of the dice. He returned to his command tent and gave his orders. First, his elite Numidian scouts were sent out to kill every forward Teutonic observer they came across. It was critical that not a single barbarian observe what was happening at the camp that night. He then outlined his plan for the tactical advantage and trap he had devised to deal with the Teutones once and for all. It would consist of placing 3,000 legionnaires in one of the dense thickets on the Roman side of the river. But off to the side, far from the fords he knew the enemy would have to use to cross, this detachment would be completely cut off from the hilltop camp, and if discovered, would all be massacred. However, Marius assured them that the position on the far left of what would become the enemy front line in battle was a thicket so dense of primordial trees that even a decent inspection from the enemy would keep this force concealed from prying eyes, and thus it was worth the risk. Still, the danger would be extreme, and as consul, he could not lead this element himself, but that if he could, he would. So he asked his officers for one of them to volunteer to lead this dangerous mission. Many hands shot up, and Marius selected Claudius Marcellus, most likely a military tribune from a noble family. That night, this force moved and went completely unobserved and concealed themselves in the thicket. Their orders were to wait until the battle was raging, with both armies fully engaged, and only then reveal themselves and attack the Teutones in the rear of their battle line. It was a huge risk, as his concealed force would not be able to move and would have very limited supplies of food and water, which meant Marius would have to get the enemy to engage on his terms as soon as possible.
The following morning,
the Teutones and their Celtic allies burst forth from the forest and soon came to cover the entire plain across the river, their warriors at the front, while their vast wagon train arrayed in concentric circles on the incline of the plain, where the tribe's elderly, women, and children made camp and prepared to watch the coming battle, like the viewing stands of an arena. From the palisades of the walls of his camp, Marius observed the barbarian army. Contrary to experience and their reputation of being demons filled with bloodlust, was relatively disciplined. They moved in an orderly manner across the fords of the river, not screaming or hollering as they had at his fortress, but silent, resolved. Tens of thousands crossed and formed into a well-formed rectangle at the base of the hill that the Romans occupied. Timing was critical, as the battle had to happen now, on his terms. So before the walls of his fortified camp atop the hill, Marius arrayed his legions for battle and challenge. Uncharacteristically, the Teutones did not take the bait, but remained in their formation at the bottom of the hill. So in order to ensure a battle, the consul mounted his warhorse at the head of his killers on one flank, and on the other, all of his Numidian and Mauritanian cavalry. But then he left the formation and rode out in front of the middle of his army and proceeded to give a speech to his legionaries, telling them that they had the advantage, to obey his orders, to hold their position, to let the enemy army exhaust themselves by charging up their hill. And when their centurions gave the order to release their two pilum, and then engage methodically and carefully with Scutum and Gladius, he made it clear to them that they held the high ground, and striking down at an enemy was always favorable. He warned his legionaries against the temptation to break their lines and charge down at fleeing warbands. Above all, they must hold the hilltop, never one to wear ornamental armor, apart from the gleaming white horsehair plume which crested his consul's helm. He drew his sword and pointed at the enemy. He then said he would stand with them, and to only move when they heard the signal to advance. He reminded them of how mercilessly he had drilled them. This brought a roar of laughter from his men. Then, to their shock and awe, he dismounted, was handed a scutum, and he took his place in the front of the center of their line. Their consul and general would fight with them as a common soldier. A prearranged signal was blown. And the Roman cavalry on the wings, a force approaching 10,000, charged down the steep hill. The thunder of so many horses' hooves hitting the ground must have been deafening as they neared. The Teutones, in their rectangular battle formation, braced themselves to receive the charge into their lines, as the thousands of horses, with the added weight of their riders and equipment, grouped so closely together, and the steep gradient of the hill adding to their speed, caused the ground under their feet to vibrate violently. In a natural response, the Teutones clustered closer and closer together and overlapped their shields, with the men in their rear ranks pushing forward to brace the ranks in front, hoping their combined mass would counteract the sheer kinetic force of the onrushing Roman cavalry, just enough to blunt the worst effects of the charge. Their warriors in the first few ranks equipped with spears held them out, though most were equipped with longswords and did the same, in an effort to cause some of the horses to shy away at the last instant. Yet the expected brutal direct assault into their lines did not come. Instead, following their consul's orders exactly, the cavalry, all the cavalry, from the light Numidians, heavy Mauritanian, and Marius's killers, all hurled their heavy spears and light javelins at the enemy. First, a single volley from the first three ranks, who then peeled off to allow those beyond to do the same. For it appears the years of waiting for the return of the barbarians had allowed the mixed cavalry to drill and practice coordinated maneuvers together to fit any situation and perform difficult, seemingly impossible assault tactics on command. The light Numidian horsemen excelled at throwing their javelins, as they were their primary weapon. However, for the heavy cavalry to hurl their spears, ancient lances, rob them of theirs. This only makes sense when you understand that this attack was not designed to do real damage, but rather to provoke the fabled Furor Teutonicus, the lethal bloodlust that had annihilated legions. But this time, it would be on Consul Marius's terms, and his unorthodox tactic worked exactly as he knew it would. The tribal army had sustained significant casualties in their first few ranks, and the warriors beyond, seeing their friends and comrades wounded or dead, became enraged, bellowing demonic war cries. And as the last of the Roman cavalry peeled off to ride back towards their camp on the hilltop, their high chieftain, King Teutabad, raised his massive greatsword and pointed it at the assembled legions, and the Teutones charged uphill. The exact distance from the base of the hill to the top is unclear, but it was significant, and a very steep climb, which not only vastly slowed the furor of the charge, but resulted in their finest warriors in the front ranks becoming completely winded, if not exhausted, before they had even made contact with the arrayed Roman legions. On the flat of the hilltop, the legionaries acted exactly the way Marius had trained them to. As the enemy neared, raising their first pilum, and when they were 20 yards away, launched their first volley in response to shouted commands from their centurions. They then raised their second pilum, and repeated the volume at 10 yards. The fact that the Teutones were struggling uphill, coupled with a steep gradient, meant that both volleys struck well into their lines. The two volleys were withering, not just killing enemies too concerned with keeping up with their comrades to notice the incoming peril, but any who did and raised their shields and caught the projectiles suddenly found their shields rendered useless because the new Marian pilum always bent into an L shape and were heavy, meaning in order to simply move forward at speed, they had to drop their shields, creating new obstacles on the ground for the men behind. Following their consul's example, who they knew was fighting in the front line with them, the Roman legionaries braced themselves to receive Furor Teutonicus. Scutums held forward with one arm, and freshly drawn gladii held in the other, angled to strike over their shield. When melee combat was imminent, they first punched out with their rounded rectangular protection, the metal boss at the center dazing their individual opponents, followed by a methodical thrust of their short swords. Recall that the Gladius Hispaniensis was primarily a stabbing weapon, designed to deliver devastating wounds each time it entered an enemy, and massive internal damage each time it was withdrawn, causing deep wounds that, even if missing vital organs, caused blood to spill out at a rate that, if not immediately seen to, would cause an enemy to simply bleed out. In contrast, most of the Teutones fought with longswords, lethal in ideal conditions, but slashing blades were completely unsuitable at Aquae Sextii. The hill itself forced the attackers to become tightly packed at the front, and their swords required a minimum of a 3-foot radius from a warrior's center to be effective in battle. Couple this with the fact that they were attacking uphill and would have to push a legionary back a step to confront them on a level plane. And slashing upward was impossible because all they would hit was a legionary scutum. The Romans held their line at the edge of the hilltop, never taking a step forward or back, cutting down the now sporadic assaults as the steep incline and barrage of pilum had completely broken up the Teutonic charge. Realizing that he was sending his now disorganized army into a Roman meat grinder, High King Teutabad had his signalers blow the horn that sounded the order to withdraw, and withdraw his warriors did, meeting him at the midpoint of the hill, while in the distance beyond the banks of the Roman side of the river, and pouring across the fords were the rest of the warriors of their massive horde, including the fresh raiders of the Teugeni tribe. The High King considered he outnumbered the Romans at least 3-1, perhaps even 4-1, and it seemed impossible that they could not crush them. And as his reinforcements were coming across the river, he ordered a second assault. The Teutones bellowed war cries and charged again. But this time more unified, and the Romans were hard-pressed to resist it. Yet because they held the high ground and were stabbing down, gravity itself was their ally. The Teutonic losses were horrendous, while they inflicted nearly no casualties to the Roman line, apart from minor wounds to some legionaries. The sheer number of dead tribesmen that littered the incline before the Romans would prove to be a hindrance moving forward at all. Once again, High King Teutabad withdrew and rallied the survivors of the failed assault on the legions, allowing the wounded and exhausted to retreat to the rear, and combined his remaining warriors with the fresh reinforcements, which finally forded the river into a colossal, perhaps 50,000-man rectangle, and resolved to use all the forces remaining to him to finally crush the Romans. He gave the order to advance and walked with his warriors, setting the pace. A slow, measured approach. The tribesmen still bellowed their war cries, which grew ever louder as they witnessed or had to march on top of their thousands of dead, their brothers, cousins, friends, and family, just to reach the summit of the hill on which the Roman line stood, never having advanced or retreated an inch. Consul Marius had used the time in which it took for the enemy to reform to rotate the cohorts of his legions, thus allowing the warriors of the previous front line to withdraw, mend their wounds, catch their breath, and be ready to enter battle when ordered, which meant the fresh cohorts of the new front line still had their two pilum, which were launched again at 20 and 10 yards as this disciplined version of Furor Teutonicus approached. After receiving the first two devastating volleys during the initial assault, the Teutones had learned what to expect and adapted. Thus, the result of this second double volley of pilum was muted, with most being caught on shields and bending, with the shields then being discarded immediately after the second volley, and causing no confusion in the Teutones formation. Just yards away, his army organized. King Teutobat pointed at the Romans with his sword and bellowed a cry of lament that encompassed the entirety of their journey. The sorrow of having to forsake their homeland, the comrades that they had lost along the way of their 20-year odyssey, for all they had sacrificed in the multitude of wars they had had to fight against the mightiest tribes of Celtic Europe in their quest to find their promised land, a new home, and a cry of the deepest grief for the annihilation of their brother tribe, the Ambrones, at the hands of these Romans. His cry turned to a scream of rage incarnate, inhuman, as if their high king were the vessel for their god's rage. As it reached the ears of each individual warrior, it resonated through the very souls of his army, and the spirit filled them, unleashing Furor Teutonicus on the new legions of Gaius Marius. The assault unfolded unlike anything the Republic's greatest and most experienced warrior had ever experienced. Fighting in the front line, the consul could no longer yell orders, which would be passed on by signalers, because he, his legionaries fighting next to him, and their entire front were locked in intense combat, so intense that to ignore what was happening right in front of one for even the slightest hint of an instant meant death. Total war. The legionaries quickly learned that even the most outrageous tales they had heard circulated around the public for the last decade did not even begin to describe the unholy battle frenzy that had possessed the enemy. Already far more tall and larger in stature than the Romans, they seemed stronger and more powerful. The blows they dealt with the metal bosses on their scutum, which only an hour before had dazed and stunned Teutones, now seemed to have little effect. The barbarians seemed to brush them off and savagely attack the legionaries with their spears and swords, with a new speed and accuracy that must have seemed like their dark gods had infused them with their demonic essence. And the Romans started taking casualties. Legionaries fell. Those in the front line had no relief, for after felling a tribal warrior, expending extreme amounts of effort and energy, they seemed to be instantly replaced by a seemingly more dangerous foe. Relief only came when a high-pitched whistle was blown, and the front line turned sideways and stepped back, while the second line stepped through the narrow gaps created to take their turn at the front. Consul Marius moved back with his men, but not to the rear of the cohort. Instead, he stayed in the second line to catch his breath. Soaked in sweat beneath his armor, he took a moment to survey the battlefield as best he could. On the far side of the river, the semicircles of Teutonic wagons were full of their old women and children perched atop them, cheering and crying out, as if they were watching this battle in some arena. What was missing was the mass of warriors that he had previously seen making their way down to and across the river, which meant the vast bulk of the warriors of the Teutonic horde was across and fully committed to this assault. With the chaos of the battle, from his vantage, he could not see if the last of their reinforcements had climbed up the hill to join the massive formation attacking his army as his view was blocked. But he reasoned that it had to be only a matter of time before the barbarian force was fully committed to this battle, meaning soon the rear of their formation would be exposed to the force he had concealed in the thicket. He had full confidence in Legate Marcellus and knew that he and his 3,000 would attack at the correct moment, but he could not tell if the trap he had devised would be sprung in seconds, minutes, or half an hour. The only thing that was clear was that it would come soon, but his legions were hard-pressed. Romans were dying. The only thing that was clear to him was that his trap would be sprung soon, and thus his legions must hold the line. He must hold the line and not give an inch until the trap was sprung. He had given prearranged orders to be executed in sequence once it was. The enemy's skill, strength, amplified by the Führer, along with their huge advantage in sheer numbers, meant that holding the line was everything. And without his presence in the front line, he noticed, inch by inch, some legionaries being pushed back by the sheer ferocity of the assault. Resolved, the 55-year-old consul tapped the legionary in front of him and took his place in the center of the front line again. He blocked with his scutum and stabbed out with his gladius. His lifetime of experience in epic battles across the Roman world gave each of his strikes an almost surgical precision, knowing exactly what available parts of the body of an enemy warrior would cause the most grievous wounds. Gaius Marius cut and cut and cut down every Teutonic champion who came against him, all wishing to claim the honor of killing him. His peerless speed and skill were quickly noticed, inspiring the men around him, and those beyond were soon in awe as they witnessed why the people of the Republic called him the Achilles of Rome. At first just those around him, but then those further away, and soon his legions were chanting, "Marius, Marius, Marius," an ode to his virtus, which drowned out and dissipated the effect of Führer Teutonicus, because his men, who loved, respected, revered, and feared him as their general, suddenly understood that the greatest warrior the Republic had ever seen in their lifetimes stood with them and inspired his legions, who redoubled their efforts, as if his presence spread his aura across the battlefield, filling his men with unlimited endurance. The combat was beyond intense, and the losses on both sides were becoming significant. The Teutones relentless, and the Romans immovable. A blood feud in which no side would give an inch. But for the Romans, who had rotated the lines of their cohorts in and out of combat, exhaustion was becoming a major issue, especially since they had to ration water, as they had not yet secured a reliable source. Their blood, sweat, and inability to rehydrate was becoming a critical weakness. Pressed together with the chaos and heat of battle, even legionaries in the rear looked on the point of dropping. Yet at that moment, when the Roman will seemed about to break, as the Teutones' numerical superiority was truly about to come into play, the sound the consul had been waiting for finally came. A bellowed warning, a cry of emergency, came faintly above the din of battle, first carried to the Roman lines on the wind from the families watching the battle across the river, then from Teutonic warriors at the rear of their army on the hill, took up the call of alarm, followed by urgent wails of an emergency, and the pressure on the Roman front suddenly lessened a little, enough for legionaries to breathe between blocks and strikes. But soon the call became a widespread panic cry of terror, even from enemies in front of them, and the pressure stopped completely as the entire Teutonic army turned and fled down the hill in a complete retreat. Unorganized, unplanned, unexpected, and in complete disarray. The reason for this was that the consul's trap had been sprung. The concealed force of 3,000 infantry marched out in a solid battle line from the dense thicket that had concealed them, and was marching to attack the Teutones' army in its flank and rear. To the barbarians, It appeared as if an entire legion had suddenly materialized out of nowhere. And perhaps because of the frenzied nature of their attack, fueled by fear of an oncoming disaster, central control of the horde became impossible. Thus, as their relatives across the river panicked, so did the warriors at the rear of their formation, and it spread to their entire army, which caused them to break their assault and flee downhill, desperate not to be cut off from the river and their families beyond. And like clockwork, Marius' prearranged orders for this moment came in a series of horn-blown signals. First, from around the flanks of the legions, his cavalry came charging forth in a very narrow straight line on either side to ensure that none of the enemies could flee into the forest, and force the entire horde into the bottleneck created by the few fords back across the river. Finally, the signal that the legions had been waiting for, that allowed them to charge down at the hated foe. All the frustration the Romans had experienced since this tribe had taunted them on the walls of their fortress, and as they marched away, mockingly asking if they had any messages for their wives, sisters, and daughters, because they soon would be with them in Italy, came pouring forth. Rage that unleashed Furor Romanicus. Mercy was not even a distant conception to Marius' enraged legions. They cut down the fleeing enemy literally whenever they could, sprinting to stab every Teutonic warrior in their completely undefended backs as they ran. There was no order, no discipline, as if they had become instruments of Mars, their war god's will, filled with his red-hot wrath. This was not simply running down a fleeing enemy after a hard-fought battle. It was an almost gleeful slaughter on a scale the world had not witnessed since their brothers, cousins, fathers, and friends had met their end in the defeat in 105 at the Battle of Arausio at the hands of the Cimbri. Now was the time for vengeance. Exhausted, Consul Marius stopped after he had led the charge down the hill to simply breathe and get his bearings. He was soon surrounded by a small element of his elite personal honor guard of heavy cavalry, his killers, who tracked him wherever he was on the battlefield. They had brought his warhorse with them, and after the consul had taken a drink of water, he mounted and was forced to survey what he had unleashed. His legionaries were vanquishing the barbarian army with a bloodlust that he knew he could not control. No matter what signals he ordered blown, his disciplined men, who he had drilled into instruments of his will, would not obey because they would not hear it. His men had become possessed with the worst of the mad fury of the war god. And perhaps, just perhaps, Marius had himself, because he made no effort to cease the carnage. The Teutones, trapped against the river, with but a trickle of their enormous horde able to get across using the few fords, were surrounded by an ever-growing number of legionaries who pressed the tens of thousands of tribal warriors ever closer together, so tightly packed that they had no room in which to fight. They could not slash with their swords or even raise their shields, and the Romans, like the grinding jaws of a shark, devoured them until not a single warrior was left standing on their side of the river. But that was not enough. The cavalry surged across the water, their horses not requiring the fords, while the heavily armored legionaries were forced to use them for fear of being pulled under the water by the weight of their chainmail. Some echoes of their discipline must have remained, because they assembled into their cohorts on the far bank before charging forward. The cavalry was already riding down every fleeing enemy warrior, and beginning to surround the concentric semicircles of wagons on which their families were perched. And the assault continued. Once the bulk of the legions were across the river, the Teutones as a tribe were slaughtered wholesale, effectively wiped from the face of existence in the most brutal fashion. Their old, women, and even older children would not surrender, and attacked the Romans with daggers, spears, staffs, canes, and whatever was close at hand. They stood no chance. The horror continued. Of the over 200,000 peoples of the brother Teutonic and Ambrone tribes, only 8,000 were captured to be sold into slavery, and 3,000 ran away from what became known as the Battle of Aquae Sextii. The legions sacked every huge wagon and cart for spoils from the tribe's 20-year wandering across Europe, and every legionary returned to their camp atop the hill with arms full of gold, silver, weapons, and valuables, which did little to conceal the fact that their armor and bodies were covered in blood and gore. Each one of them gave over 1/3 of these spoils to the consul as his share to distribute to his officers and award legionaries who he had witnessed or were reported to have fought and led exceptionally well by their example. The resultant pile became so large that it filled the forum next to his command tent, and it still kept coming and coming. So the consul ordered that it all be collected, and that all new tribute be piled upon it outside of their camp, exactly where his legions had held their line all day. That night, he called an assembly of his entire army before the 5-story pyramid of treasure that was his share of the spoils. He first awarded huge portions to his officers, worthy legionaries, and a rare occurrence, gave 1/4 to be split among the men of his companion Allahs from distant lands, and all non-citizens. Then Marius took his place on the platform where Martha had just completed a sacrifice to their gods to thank them for their aid in their great victory. He looked up at the now 2-story pyramid of the spoils that remained. From one of the bonfires that lit up the spectacle, a torch was brought to him. He then turned and looked out at his massed legions in their ranks, and then held the flame aloft in salute to them. In response, his legionaries in unison bellowed,
Imperator! Imperator! Imperator!
Their consul, general, and comrade smiled and gave them a solemn nod in thanks for the acclamation the tradition dictated must come naturally for a commander to be eligible for a triumph upon his return to Rome. He then turned back to the pyramid of his personal spoils, raised his head and arms as if speaking directly to the gods, to declare that he was making all of it an offering to Jupiter Optimus Maximus. His legions watched in stunned silence as their consul was about to burn this colossal treasure. Yet just as he was about to throw his torch on it, he was interrupted by the sound of a galloping horse quickly approaching. Its rider, a messenger, made clear by the fact that he was holding out a scroll and yelling for the consul's attention. When he reached the platform, the messenger dropped off his exhausted mount, broke the seal of the scroll, and read aloud the proclamation as he had been ordered to do so by the Senate and people.
With the news that in his absence, he had been elected consul for a 5th time.
And the legions broke out in a cheer, which became a roar as the consul turned, offered a silent prayer to the king of Olympus, and hurled the flaming torch onto the pyramid of riches, which erupted into a gigantic inferno from being covered in oil and fat. The colossal blaze was so bright that it illuminated the valley beyond. A nightmarish scene after the battle, bodies as far as the eye could see. To understand the scale of the aftermath of the slaughter, Plutarch's words.
The peoples of Marsilia fenced their vineyards round with the bones, and that the soil where the dead bodies, soaked in the rain which fell throughout the winter, had rotted away, was fertilized to a considerable depth by the putrefied matter, and became so rich that it yielded in future years quite extraordinary harvests.
Gaius Marius's victory had been total. He had wiped out half of the barbarian threat to the Republic, fully half the horde, over 250,000, while suffering only 900 deaths to his own men. The next day, he allowed his army to drink, feast, and rest. And on the next, early in the morning, he was shook awake by his page, who handed him a sealed letter from the Senate. The consul sat up, opened it, and began reading the shocking news. It was a preliminary report and plea for aid, with very few details, except for the fact that the Cimbri had overcome the Alpine defenses placed by Rome's other consul, Quintus Lutatius Catullus, and were now in control of the Po Valley, meaning in effect, they had conquered central northern Italy, a geographic position that would allow the Cimbric horde to descend on the walls of Rome itself within a week if they chose. This was an emergency. Wide awake, he jumped out of his bed and immediately ordered that his legions break camp and summoned his officers for a council of war. He called for his Lixi to assist him in donning his armor, and the consul considered. The Senate had provided only the base level of information, but for a consular army to lose control of the north of Italy, recent history gave him cause to think that it must mean that the Cimbri had annihilated them. The loss of so many Roman warriors at a time when the manpower crisis was still extreme made it critical for his legions to move at breakneck speed back through the province of Gallia Narbonensis that he had just retaken, cross the Alps, and block the Cimbric horde's path to Rome. A monumental task for any other consul at any other time in Roman history. But his new legions were more than capable of the speed. Then he considered more. Sulla had been serving with those legions. And though he mourned the loss of so many brave Romans in that army, if they had indeed fallen, then it stood to reason that Sulla had as well. Without his charismatic rival, nothing and no one would stop him from attaining the consulship 7 times, which caused Gaius Marius, who believed himself Jupiter's chosen, to grin. The next time we go deep, we will discover how the Cimbri were able to take northern Italy with such ease, and learn the fate of the so seductive Lucius Cornelius Sulla, as we experience the epic battle of Tridentum, as versus the Cimbrian War continues. Thank you for listening to Deep into History. And please don't forget to tell everyone you know about the show. And please support me at patreon.com/deepintohistory. You can follow me at Deep Into History on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. This experience we share is produced by the one and only York Campbell of Poetic Earthling Studios, and the introduction is performed by Shante. And as always, my dear friend, take care of yourself. I truly look forward to the next time we go deep.
Remember to support the show at patreon.com/deep into history.